Alright, so we're going to look at some more of these problems. So in this first one we talked about it has an amplitude of 1/2 and a period of 2 pi divided by 3. So that means that my outermost point is going to be 2 pi over 3. Now to figure out the other points, you want to take half of 2 pi over 3. So 2 pi over 3 times 1/2 is 2 pi over 6, which is 1/3. So this is going to be pi over 3. And then half of that would be this term right here, and that's going to be pi over 6. And then what you need to do is count by 1/6s. 1/6, 2/6, 3/6. So 3 pi over 6 would be pi over 2. So 3 pi over 6 is our other one, and that's pi over 2. So those are our 5 points. Sine curve, starts at 0, goes up and down. So it's going to go up to 1/2 and down to -1/2 in this case. So it's going to start at 0, go up to 1/2, back down to 0, down to -1/2, and back up. And so there's our sine curve. So when you're graphing these, you've got to make sure you're labeling your x-axis and labeling your y-axis in order to get this set up right. Okay, so let's look at this one. The period is 6 pi, so it's 2 pi divided by 1/3, which is 6 pi. So this piece is 6 pi, and then we're going to take the halfway point, so half of 6 is 3 pi, and then half of that is 3 pi over 2, and then we're going to count 3 pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 is 6 pi over 2, 6 pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 is 9 pi over 2. Our amplitude is 2 and -2. So this time we want to start at 2 because cosine curve starts up. Come down here, down to -2, back up here, back up to -2, and this is our cosine curve. Okay. Now this one, remember I told you to change that to a negative just so that we could see what happened. So this is sort of like the first one that we did. The period is 2 pi over 3, so half of that would be pi over 3. Half of that would be pi over 6. And then count by 1/6s. 1/6, 2/6, 3/6. So 3/6 is pi over 2. Our amplitude is 2 and -2. So here's the difference. Normally cosine starts high at 2, but because of the negative sign, we're gonna flip it. So it's actually going to start down here. Then it's going to come to 0, then it's going to go back up, back to 0, and back down here. So it is the cosine curve flipped, if you compare these two, flipped across the x-axis. Okay? Alright, so notice on the tangent curve, I drew my chart a little bit differently. So tangent is the only curve that spans the y-axis. So I have to make sure I split this among the x's, among the positives and negatives. My period on this one, tangent, the period is pi. So pi divided by 1/2, because this is 1/2, b is 1/2, is 2 pi. So I have to take that 2 pi and split it to the positive side and the negative side. So that means I'm going to have pi over here and pi over here. So my highest value over here is pi, and my lowest value over here is -pi. Now, in the middle will be pi over 2 and pi over 2. Okay? My amplitude is 4, so that means that at pi over 2, I'm going to be going up to 4 instead of 1 like I did before. So I'm going to go up to 4 here and down to 4 here. I have 0 here And my asymptotes for tangent are always the outer parts there. So there's my tangent curve. Okay? Now cotangent, again, has a period of pi. So I have to divide by the value of b, so it's pi divided by 2. So it's pi divided by 2 here. And then I'm going to do just like I did with the sine and cosine curve. Half of that is pi over 4. Half of that is pi over 8. And then I'm counting by eighths. 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. So this would be 3 pi over 8. Cotangent also has asymptotes, and our asymptotes are on the outermost part of the curve. It's 0 in the middle. But cotangent goes up and down, so here's our amplitude of 3 and -3. So it's going to go up to 3 and then down to -3, and so there's our cotangent curve. Alright, let's do this example. So this is a secant one. So to graph our secant curve, we remember secant is 1 over cosine. Sorry, paper in my way. So secant is 1 over cosine. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our period. So here's 2 pi. Here's pi. Pi over 2. 3 pi. Oops, I messed up here. I'm sorry. This is going to be 4 pi. Sorry. 2 pi divided by 1/2. So I'm sorry. This is going to be 4 pi. This is going to be 2 pi. This is just going to be pi, and this is going to be 3 pi. So I took the 4 pi, half of that is 2 pi, half of that is pi, and then count my pi's. 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Now what I want to do is very lightly, so my amplitude is 1/2 and -1/2. So to give me a better idea how to graph this, what I'm going to do is sketch the cosine curve. So here's our cosine curve, very lightly. This is what our cosine curve looks like. Okay, so now secant is going to have an asymptote right here, an asymptote right here, and here my curve is going to go up. Here my curve is going to go down, and here my curve is going to go up. So I really find it so much easier to graph the base curve, that cosine curve, and then flip it to get my secant and cosecant. Alright, so here's a cosecant example. Cosecant, the period is 2 pi, but I'm taking 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi. So this would be pi. This is pi over 2. Half of that is pi over 4. And then count by 1/4. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. Okay. Now, cosecant is 1 over sine. So here's my 3 and my -3. So sine would look like this. So it would come down here. So there's my sine curve. So that means the cosecant is going to have an asymptote here, asymptote here, asymptote here. There's a point, there's a point, and I've got my curve up, my curve up, my curve down, and my curve down. Alright, so far so good. Alright, 2 more. Cotangent again. So cotangent, the period is pi. So pi divided by 1/2 would be 2 pi. So cotangent does not span the x-axis, or the y-axis. So half of that is pi. Pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. Okay. So with cotangent, my asymptotes are always the outermost part. Amplitude is 2 and -2, which tells me I'm going to go up to 2 and down to 2. And here's my 0. And there's my cotangent curve. And last one, a cosecant again, is 1 over sine. Period is 4 pi. So here's 4 pi. Half of that is 2 pi. Half of that is pi. Count by pi's, that's 3 pi. Okay, so remember it's going to be the sine curve with an amplitude of 3 and negative 3. So sine curve. Right, so asymptote here, asymptote here, asymptote here, and then my lower half of my parabola, so to speak, and the upper half. Alright, I hope this helps.